We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, first of all, to Christine for helping us in getting this webinar together today. Good afternoon and good evening to some of you who are joining us internationally. And it's already nighttime where you are. I see a few of you there in the attendee list. My name is Alan Charanet, and I am the project coordinator of the Extractive Resource Governance Program, or ERGP, at the School of Public Policy, University of Calgary. On behalf of my team, I want to welcome all of you to this discussion and very sincerely thank our panelists and our partners for their hard work in bringing it to life. Of course, today's webinar is entitled Collaborative Governance, Challenges and Opportunities for Latin America, and it's part of the ERGP's international series. These types of initiatives are so important to us because they bring together diverse experience in the field of resource governance, and they underscore a really key element of our mandate, which is partnership. The ERGP works in extractive and natural resource governance, both here in Canada and around the world, while growing knowledge networks and building capacity. Our center, located at Canada's #1 policy institution, provides training and education, technical and strategic advising, research and analysis, and takes on global projects. We invite you to get to know us online at ergp.ca, where you can subscribe to our quarterly newsletter and to follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter if you're not already part of our network. Today, we're going to be exploring some critical themes in collaborative or shared governance. We're particularly looking at governance through the lens of community and asking some core questions. So, for example, how should we understand collaborative governance and the layered challenges and opportunities that it presents? What kinds of principles can help guide these processes? And how can the structure of organizations, whether they're government, industry, or community, affect outcomes? To help us unpack these questions, I'm very glad to briefly introduce our panel for today, beginning with Dr. Pablo Politzer, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science here at the University of Calgary. Pablo is a specialist in comparative politics, and his research focuses on the evolution of violent conflict, especially among armed actors such as military, police forces, and non-state armed groups in both authoritarian and democratic regimes. An award-winning author, he's also held the Canada Research Chair in Latin American Politics, is a fellow at the Center for, sorry, my screen is scrolling away from me, Center for Military and Strategic Studies, and is the former director of the Latin American Research Center. I'm further privileged to introduce Karina Brino, an absolute mining industry expert with decades of experience in Canada and in Chile. Karina first worked in the public sector in British Columbia's mining ministry, and later in the private sector as president and CEO of the BC Mining Association. She has extensive expertise in the areas of corporate social responsibility, environmental awareness, community engagement, and risk management. Our third panelist is Dr. Lake Segares, researcher and adjunct professor at the Universidad Católica of Chile. Lake is an internationally recognized expert on cycle-inclusive urban planning, civil society development, and participatory planning theory and practice as they relate to urban regional governance. She works with cross-disciplinary and university community government collaborations within a framework of participatory action research and through ongoing partnerships, which have deepened over more than 20 years of committed engagement. An awarded author and editor, Lake focuses on resilience, social justice, and inclusion, and has been highly recognized for her work in Chile and beyond. Finally, I introduce Regina Masai, Executive Director of the Forestry Stewardship Council of Chile. Regina is a civil industrial engineer with extensive experience in environmental, social, and risk management. Her achievements are found in the development and implementation of corporate social responsibility and sustainability. She's directed, executed, and advised on projects for companies in the mining, forestry, and salmon farming sectors, and has participated in verification processes of sustainability standards in both mining and forestry. Regina is a member of the Chilean group of experts for the ISO 26000 social responsibility standard, as well as numerous working groups and committees, including with the United Nations. We're also privileged to be joined by Ana Karina Perez Oropesa, Strategic Advisory and Global Advocacy Lead of the Forestry Stewardship Council at Bonn. Originally from Venezuela, Ana Karina joined the FSC in 2010 and is an expert in international and multi-stakeholder processes related to forestry, sustainability, biodiversity, and climate change. She was also responsible for driving the development of the current FSC Global Strategy, which highlights the value of forest stewardship as a comprehensive solution to address global challenges. She's also an academic tutor for courses on sustainability leadership at the University of Cambridge. So with that and with those introductions, I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to Dr. Pulitzer. As a note to our audience, I'm going to be monitoring the Q&A chat throughout the discussion, so please feel free to write and submit questions during the conversation, and we'll speak to them during that later question and answer segment. So over to you, Pablo.
Thank you very much, Alam, and for prompting this event, and thank you to and the School of Public Policy for hosting this event. I also want to thank our participants for agreeing to join in this discussion, which I'm really looking forward to. And so just to say a few words very briefly about what prompts this discussion in the first place is the idea that in many ways and across many sectors, the institutions that govern us are not working, and that this is something that is especially apparent and critical in the extractive sector, which for a number of generations has been governed very broadly by what might be termed a neoliberal governance framework that really turns on this idea of the smooth functioning of markets. And one of the principles of this framework from the very beginning by one of its foremost exponents was the idea to just knock politics off its pedestal, to kind of make decisions in a very technocratic way at the top and then kind of impose them at the bottom. And so there's widespread increasing consensus that that kind of decision making is simply not up to the big global challenges that we have before us today, like sustainable development, meeting the demands of climate change, dealing with complex security problems, even global pandemics. That kind of framework is simply not working. And so what I found really interesting is is seeing that across many sectors, places in the extractive industry, there's been a great deal of effort over the past couple of generations to move in a less hierarchical, less vertical, more participatory, more open, more horizontal kind of governance that involves decision-making in a more participatory, collaborative kind of way. So what I wanted to do today was simply to engage in an exercise of lateral thinking, because it seems to me that people in different places are maybe using somewhat different terminology and dealing with somewhat different sets of challenges, but are really struggling with similar kinds of problems. And so our aim today is trying to take a very first modest step to try and flesh some of that out and determine what some of that similar kind of challenge or set of challenges really is. So what we're going to do is start with Lake Segarras, who is a renowned, well-known expert on issues of collaborative governance, albeit in a completely different area than the extractive industry. So Lake has a great deal of expertise in collaboration, participatory kinds of decision-making in cities, in the urban context, with important issues such as ciclovías or bicycle lanes, amongst many others. And so she shares a combination of academic expertise, but also local activist expertise. So I know that, so we're not going to ask Lake about extractive industry at all. That is not that's her expertise, but about collaborative governance. So why don't we turn to Lake and simply ask you to speak about how you understand collaborative governance from your perspective, both in theoretical terms, but also in your practice as both here in Santiago or in other places. Can you tell us about collaborative governance in theory and practice as you see it? Lake.
Wow, thank you so much. What an amazing invitation. And yeah, what a great space to be in today. Sort of one part of me in Canada where I was born and grew up, and one part in Chile where I came when the country was at full dictatorship mode, and it was certainly a shock to the system at the time, and it was has been an enormous learning experience. So thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you also for not expecting me to be an expert on extractive industries. Although I must say I have spent quite a bit of time in the Northern Desert, first as a journalist where I actually visited a lot of mines, and then as a writer I also did a book on the Atacama Desert. So I have a lot of interest in these kinds of issues, although they are sort of beyond what I do. So collaborative governance, there's a lot of ways of coming at it, but I guess I'll sort of look at the two main legs of it, which make the most sense because of what I do and which may make sense to you or not. The first is that a lot of citizen participation, particularly in Chile, it's the very light version. It's a technocrat version. It's a checklist. It's you invite people often to an expensive hotel downtown, and then you're kind of surprised that a lot of people don't come. And then you say, oh, and we're going to do this. What do you think? And they may get as far as therapy on Sherry Arnstein's ladder or scale. So they may talk about their feelings or what's going on in their territory or their community, but they're probably not going to make a big difference in the project that actually gets done, and even less in the planning that goes around it. So I'm definitely not talking about that technocratic, step-by-step, let's meet the requirements and get on with doing what we were going to do anyway kind of approach, which unfortunately is still extremely prevalent in Chile, and is part of the context of participation wherever it occurs or for whatever issue. So I'm really interested in collaborative governance as it's rooted in democratic theory. So those of you who are political scientists will probably relate and maybe even know much more than I do about some of the things that I'll just mention very quickly. But the importance of democracy and human rights as the basis for social dialogue and social decision-making and problem solving. There's huge debates, Carol Pateman on, and there's a lot of influence from the American experiences, which aren't necessarily all that relevant for elsewhere. And then in Latin America, one of, I think, the great thinkers is Avritzer, who really has looked a lot at what democracy could be, should be, how it's emerging in different kinds of participatory spaces, but much more empowered participatory spaces. So more related to making decisions about healthcare systems or anti-hunger food programs or urban planning or participatory budgeting, which I guess probably many of you know was an innovation that started in southern Brazil and has now spread worldwide, with good and bad attributes to it, depending on where and how it's applied. But I think the sort of essence of this, and what's most relevant for collaborative governance, is sort of three of the more recent tendencies in thinking about democracy. And just before I go mention those very quickly, I will say that I am always thinking about sustainability transitions with justice, social justice and inclusion. When I talk about anything to do with participation or transformation or social change or whatever we're doing today, to me, that has to be a central goal. Because if not, humanity, our ways of life, for example, at the very least, we don't have a great prognosis at the moment. We really need to transform. We really need to change from very high consumption, very wasteful societies, but where it's a very small proportion of the global population that is actually doing all the consuming, and is now often telling people in the rest of the world, oh, you shouldn't eat that, or you shouldn't drive that, or you shouldn't do things this way. So there's a lot of power imbalances that go into these conversations and into the context for our collaborative governance. So I think in terms of thinking about sustainability, it transitions with a strong social inclusion and social justice perspective. We're really talking about very specific parts of democratic theory. We're talking about deliberation, which is something that goes on mainly in small groups, and somehow those small groups reach out and can influence whole societies with their new ideas and their innovation, not only in thinking, but also in acting. And then also the ideas of deepening democracy developed by Archon Fung and Eric Olin Wright about, what does it really mean to do democracy every day, to practice democracy, the way we practice the piano or a sport or walking or whatever. What does it mean to make that really part of our daily life? And more recently, the issue or the concept of empowered democracy. And I think that one is really interesting because while the other concepts focus a lot on individuals in small groups, but mostly they look at democracy from an individual citizen perspective, empowered democracy tends to look more at collective citizen organizations. So if we make a little step sideways into collaborative planning, which is the second leg of what I see as collaborative governance, or what I'd like to share with you today. Planning, of course, is a huge industry. It's a huge academic. It's a huge it's a huge everything. It's everywhere and nowhere, and often it has been quite relegated and stigmatized under neoliberalism, as Pablo mentioned. But planning to me is really, really interesting because it's essentially interdisciplinary. It has to deal with scale. It has to deal with space, which are concepts from geography. But it also has to deal with these concepts that I've just mentioned from political science. But above all, it has to deal with reality. And reality mostly doesn't conform very well to our theories, or if you're a modeler, you're statistical or transport engineering or other models. So collaborative planning, the central thinking developed really well by Patsy Healy over the past 20 years or so, is, how do we make meaning and make meaningful places together? So if planning 100 years ago when it was born was, how do we clean up the city? And then it evolved into, let's put the dirty stuff in one place and the clean stuff in another place and the place where people live in a whole other place. And then it became, that's a bit of a problem because it means people are driving or have long trips and it's very polluting, etc. Now it's making meaning together. So it's a much more inclusive, much more, it offers a lot more possibilities, I think. And within that, just to not exceed the 10 minutes, which I understand I'm supposed to be in, I'd say that really can be grounded in three forms of participation. This is according to Susskind and Eliot, but it's from the 80s, but it's still one of the best typifications I've ever found. And that is paternalism from the top down, and that produces conflict from the bottom up. Paternalism produces conflict and it doesn't really get you the best decisions. Conflict you may learn a lot, especially citizens who engage in conflicts, but you don't really resolve deep social problems. One side wins, the other side wins, there's a standoff, but you don't really get at the roots of things. And then there's co-production or collaborative, again, that word. So just to close on this, I think what's what's really central to this conversation is power. Who holds it? Who imposes their ideas and their framing on the conversation? And within that, the role of institutions in collaborative governance, which is to guarantee the equality and the quality of that conversation whenever people with different kinds of power meet together to deliberate about important social, political, economic, environmental issues.
That's great. Thanks very much, Lake. Talking about justice and power and democracy, that just warms the political scientist's heart. So thank you for that. Let me turn to Karina Bino and ask Karina to reflect on your experience in these more open, collaborative, horizontal kinds of decision-making that I know that you've had a great deal of expertise and experience in over the years, both in the public sector in Canada, later in the private sector in Canada, now the private sector in Chile, in your capacity, and I'm not sure that got mentioned in the introduction, in Candelaria mine, in the north of Chile, where you're joining us from now in Copiapó. So I wonder if you can take about 10 minutes to tell us about this experience, some of the principles that have guided you on this. Karina.
Thank you, Pablo. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. Thanks very much, Pablo and Alain, for the invitation, and especially to the ERGP for setting this conversation. I think it's very important, not only for us that are in the field of collaboration and cooperation, but also because as a society, I think we need to have more of these conversations. I'm certainly coming at it from a practitioner's view and experience. I'm certainly not going to warm your heart as Lake did with the political scientist view and experience. But I think, you know, from my personal experience, one of the reasons I've been in mining now for about 18 years, the last 5 years in the Atacama region in Chile, working for a Canadian mining company. And I think the foundation for my personal involvement in mining is because I truly believe that if not the only way, the best way to go forward with our activity is to engage meaningfully with the communities and in the communities where we operate. And I say that, you know, when we talk about concepts like social license, it's not just a concept, it's actually a way of doing things. It's actually a way of carrying out your activities. It means, you know, being true to your values. It means respect. It means integrity. It means being present. It means being committed to not only your activity, but only to the people to the people that you're working with. And the best experiences that I've had has been when you actually sit down with people and have conversations where you're actually co-creating, where you're actually getting, you know, to the point of finding some common ground. There's always going to be reasons, and there's always going to be aspects of the activity where we don't agree, or where there is going to be situations where there is going to be you know, concerns from the community. But more often than not, there are opportunities that people are interested in. And it's not just employment, it's actually what I'm finding, especially today in today's society, especially here in Chile, people are more and more interested in knowing how the activity is being carried out. When we go out in the community today, people want to know more about how we do our business. What are the practices? What are the best practices out there? You know, what are the standards, not only here in Chile, but what are the international standards? You know, how is mining done in other jurisdictions, in other countries? And engaging early when you're going to be carrying out a specific activity, or engaging early when you're going to be, you know, starting a new project, engaging early when you're going to be, you know, starting a new program, for example, is critical, because sometimes we make assumptions. We make assumptions about what people want. We make assumptions about what they need. And, you know, and sometimes we just don't get it right. And listening to what they need and listening to what they want doesn't take a lot of our time or a lot of our effort. And the other thing that we often, or sometimes where we make mistakes, is that there are two types of relationships that we need to make sure we have, and they often go parallel. There are, you know, the local relationships that we need to have with the authorities, and we need to make sure that those relationships are intact, and they need to be transparent, and they need to be constant, and we need to have, you know, very clear lines of communications. And sometimes these authorities want to be the only channel, the only line of communication into the community. And that's not necessarily what the community wants. So we need to be able to have, being very respectful of the authorities, we need to be able to have these other ways of communicating with, you know, the neighborhood associations, with the, you know, with the sports clubs, with the, you know, elders groups, with women's groups, with the small businesses, because every single group has a different need. We operate in three very distinct communities here in the Atacama region. So it's not a one fit for all. We certainly don't have the same, even in one community, we don't have the same recipe for everything. So we need to be able to adapt to every single situation, and being respectful in adhering to what, you know, we call ourselves a responsible miner. We adhere to human rights, the UN Human Rights Declaration. We have policies and we have protocols in our company that are, you know, that promote inclusion, diversity, human rights, anti-corruption. We have to stay true to all of those principles when we engage with these communities, and having these conversations in a transparent manner is helping us gain the trust of the communities and the groups that we work with. And that's helping us as well gain acceptance. It hasn't always been this way, I can guarantee you. There's been situations where the relationship has been difficult, and you know, there is ebbs and flows as well. But in my experience in the last 5 years, in particular here in Chile, especially with the context that we're living in the country right now, we need to live up to the expectations of the Chilean people. And that's more dialogue, more engagement, it's not development at any cost. We need to be able to respond to the expectations and the needs of the people of Chile. And in the communities where we operate, well, this is another discussion that we could have in another venue, but centralization is a problem because there is a lot of need in particular in the communities where we operate. So from that perspective, we do our best to respond to the needs of the communities, but certainly were not able to meet all of their necessities, and the state has a big role to play as well in reaching that point of equality and social justice.
Okay, thank you very much, Regina. It's a wonderful overview, and we'll come back to engage with some of those questions in the discussion. I want to turn to Ana Karina from the Forestry Stewardship Council, and thank you so much for joining us, Ana Karina, who's joining us from Germany, from Bonn, which is where the FSC is located. And Ana Karina has a great deal of experience in these issues of multi-stakeholder engagement, and especially at the Forestry Stewardship Council and questions of governance. So we're very grateful for you joining us. I've been communicating with Regina Masai from the FSC in Chile, who's having some trouble joining us, but we'll give her a chance to say a few words maybe at the end of when she's able to join. But let me ask you, how you see this question of collaboration through the lens of the FSC in, I guess, two different levels. One is the way that the FSC itself is organized is very collaborative in its own way, and maybe say a few words about that, but also how that kind of structure maps onto or connects with the kinds of challenges in terms of opening up the decision-making in the forestry industry itself, where there have been great steps taken in different places with all kinds of challenges, of course, to move in that more horizontal, participatory kind of collaborative direction.
Thank you, Pablo. So to start with this intervention, I would like to explain briefly what FSC is about. It's the Forest Stewardship Council, as you know, and it's an international organization that promotes the stewardship of the world's forest, as basic as that. And it's really based on collaborative governance, meaning that it brings together different stakeholders to the table who together define really what forest stewardship means. This is an effort, a big effort. FSC has been for 25 years since its inception, trying to refine this meaning. And this comes to your point, Pablo, that this is not collaborative governance, is a way to really improve the outcome. And the challenges we have now really demand the participation and the inclusion of all stakeholders that are connected to the issue. And this is the fuel, this is the energy that makes FSC what it is today. I want to relate this to our internal structure, our governance, and then to connect this with the challenges. But regarding our internal governance, I would like to use the concepts of input and output legitimacy, because I think they explain very well how FSC works on the ground. So regarding input legitimacy, meaning the participation, inclusion, how all stakeholders have a voice and as the same balance at the discussion at the table, FSC brings together, as I said, different stakeholders in the forestry sector, including social, economic, and environmental. These are organizations and individuals who are deeply involved in forestry, in forest stewardship, and they want together to negotiate and discuss how this could happen or this should happen on the ground. And here, what I mean here is that we could have in an FSC discussion, a big CEO of a big forestry company, together with an indigenous representative, together with a big a lobbying organization or environmental organization. And the FSC offers them the platform to really discuss the definition of forest stewardship. One important thing is that these stakeholders in the FSC model, in the FSC governance model, are structured per chamber. So all these three examples I gave represent these three chambers, and they have the same, the equal voting power, meaning that they all have the same rights and the same contributions without any hierarchy, as in the real world. In the FSC world, every stakeholder counts. And this is very important for the way forward, because the decisions they make, of course, are voluntary for the ones who adopt them. But the moment you adopt them, you really are ascribed to these rules. And FSC creates standards, as I said, for stewardship. But most importantly, FSC looks for solutions to make these standards happen on the ground, which is a feature in governance that really gives that connection between input and output legitimacy, because input is really like how you co-create, how you make these decisions on these important things. But then the output is really, are these decisions effective, can be implemented? And FSC has looked for solutions, for mechanisms to make these decisions happen on the ground through markets, through connections with other actors in society. And the most well-known mechanism of FSC is this logo you see here, that actually means that forest products, services come from well-managed forests, where, as I said, all this participatory and collaborative governance takes place. This is really happening from the global to the local level. And these global rules and principles and criteria that FSC have can be really translated on the ground through real local adaptations, which would be local national forest stewardship standards. These different levels, global to local, are really having a stakeholder participation at all levels. And this is also strength within FSC, that perhaps a very abstract principle at the international level, such as indigenous people's rights or workers' rights or biodiversity conservation, get translated to the very specific context. What do they mean for that country, and how they can be implemented on the ground? So this is a very important reflection regarding this input and output, and how all these things occur at the forest level. Regarding the challenges, I would like to go to the same point. It's not really about making governance participatory for the sake of doing it. It's actually for the sake of having a better outcome. And this is why FSC exists, basically. And this connects to all these challenges that come with participatory models or collaborative models. One being really high expectations, several stakeholders having a voice. Of course, this increases the expectations, the involvement of communities, involvement of forestry companies is really a tense situation. And I would say that in FSC, you treat this always as a healthy conflict, because you cannot have a very peaceful situation if you are bringing divergent points of views to the table. But this healthy conflict really can be addressed through good facilitation, providing the spaces to really refine and discuss and find common grounds on these conflicts. Another point that it is a challenge in the forestry sector, and I would like to highlight this one, because there is this misconception that the forestry sector, it's only about timber, and FSC clearly, and how we were created and how you would describe FSC, is about forest. so an ecosystem. So there is always this misconception. So then the clarification that this governance model is not only for timber, to extract timber, but actually to manage, to be the steward of the world forest. And this also links to big challenges like, well, then what is the problem we are trying to solve? In the 90s, the world was saying that deforestation was being caused by timber production. Now the debate is different. Deforestation is caused by agriculture. Therefore, the forestry sector is not being seen as the guilty of deforestation. But as you also say, we have so many challenges at the moment: climate change, biodiversity loss, social issues, that we know that the best way in FSC mechanism is to ensure resilient forests to address these global challenges. So even more than ever, we need forest stewardship to guarantee a better outcome for society overall. And this can help us, everybody, to really address these issues. Another point is the need to, or another challenge is the need to include other actors that are not traditionally part. You know that these models are traditionally a private governance, private sustainability governance models. And even though there is participation from governments, it is always a challenge to involve governments more holistically within FSC. And this also links to communities and all different stakeholders that need to be part of our system, and that certain conditions do not enable them to be fully, having a full representation in the FSC system. So the FSC system always tries to get all these things. And to really finalize this intervention, I would really like to say that collaborative governance is about the outcome. It's not about the how, it's about the why and why you want to get this. So thank you so much.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much. Let me give Regina, because I know that she was having some troubles connecting, the chance to very briefly, for maybe a couple of minutes, connect if you want to add anything from your perspective in FSC Chile. Regina, I don't know if, or we can wait until the discussion later.
I'm sorry, I'm really trying.
That's okay. Yeah, we hear you now. Okay, and we see you. Perfect.
Sorry, I arrived late. Already Pablo knows that I am in the middle of another event, but I think Ana Karina is the best representative at this moment for this issue here in the name of FSC. So I'm sure we have been discussing about these issues in advance also. So I'm sure Pablo, she already gave the most important information about FSC, okay, our challenge. So okay, I will wait until the end of the meeting. And please apologize because I will have to go out and come back again.
No problem at all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ana Karina.
So let me give, I know that Karina has to leave in about 15 minutes. So I want to give her the first chance to enter the discussion. And what I want to do in this part of the discussion is tease out some of the themes that came out, some of the common themes that came out in the presentations. And I think using somewhat different language, people really like the way that Ana Karina put this distinction between the input and the output legitimacy, and that in making the distinction regarding participation, democracy, some of the themes that Lake talked about in her own presentation, as both an end, but also a means. You can think of participation as an end in itself, simply because it's something that we care about, this more democratic, open, participatory kind of decision-making. But we can also think about it as a means through which we can get better outcomes. So I want to maybe put the question to Karina, thinking very broadly with that distinction in mind. Whether you can say a little bit more, take a few minutes to say a bit more about how, maybe some specific examples of where that kind of participation was a means for a better outcome, and where, and again, maybe keeping Ana Karina's point about healthy maybe versus unhealthy conflict in mind, where that kind of healthy conflict and through participation led to a better outcome versus maybe a situation where you might have seen an unhealthy conflict where the outcome was not so good.
Well, I was reflecting on Ana Karina's latest comment precisely because I think there are so many examples throughout even my career where participation is a means of doing, trying to resolve conflict, but at the end of the day, is the outcome that really matters, and how do you actually get there? And participation doesn't necessarily lead to a resolution. It's actually how you get to that point. How you find that common ground, and how do you get the parties to agree on somebody. Everyone has to give something, and in the end, you have to be willing to, as a company, we have to be willing to give something as well. Give in terms of, if not power, we have to be willing to accept that we're going to have to change the way we do things. And it may not have been the way we did things, even 5 years ago or 10 years ago, which is, traditionally what we hear in the mining industry, but we've never done that before, or that's not the way we do things. A very recent example here in my community is blasting. We are an urban operation. We have a way of notifying the community when we're blasting, and there was a particular instance in a situation where it was louder than normal, and the community complained, and they said, "This is enough. Like we're not going to put up with this anymore." And we suspended our activity until we actually came to resolution and an agreement with them about how we were going to continue. So again, it's not just participating in the discussion, it's actually realizing that if you're going to participate in that dialogue, if you're going to participate in that process, you have to be willing to do something. You're not just in it for the sake of saying, well, we talked to you, we heard you, but we're going to keep doing what we're doing. That doesn't work anymore. I guess that's my point. And especially today, again, talking about the Chilean context is not development at all costs. It's not just going forward with the old way of doing things. I mean, that's changed a long time ago. I mean, many, I would even venture to say most mining companies have changed the way they do things and how they relate to communities and how they engage. But we're still seeing issues, and we're still seeing problems, and we're still seeing situations where there is opposition and when there is conflict, but how you resolve that conflict is now the question. And I believe that's what Ana Karina was saying, is that, how you get to that resolution and how you get to that outcome is more important than the process itself.
Okay, thank you very much. So, let me turn to Ana Karina, actually, and ask, there was a question about elite capture in extractive industry that was posed to Karina, but I think it applies more generally as well. So this connects to the problem of power that Lake mentioned. So we've had lots of discussion about possibilities and principles and how it's better to we can have better outcomes with this more participatory kind of decision making. But what about the question of power? How does that come up in your context as an overseer of this major industry and very powerful industry? And I say this speaking from Santiago, Chile, where in the south especially, it's a very important, very powerful actor. And so how does that filter into the decision making, how you conceptualize the challenges involving more collaboration in forestry?
Right. I think, Pablo, that connecting the concept of power with leadership would be very important, at least in the FSC context and in the forestry sector. And example, and going back to the output legitimacy, FSC's timber accounts for 25% of the timber going around the world. So it's actually a really powerful situation in which FSC is involved, because we are talking about global trade. But as I said, FSC is not only about timber. But the point about understand power as leadership, because power should be understood as a service to really connect that participation to that end, to that means to an end. And of course, this is private governance. No, the rules are completely different to public governance, in which you have these groups, these elite groups who are represented by the people, and they are given the power to make decisions on behalf of everybody. In FSC's model, the notion of power is really understood as balanced, and that all stakeholders have different ideas, but at the end of the day, they have the same power when they vote, when they decide. And this also links to other certification schemes that have different distributions of power. In the extractive, for example, I think IRMA has 5 chambers, if I understood correctly. So this is the way how they have different, they weigh the power and the decision making of the organization. But yeah, to conclude, power and leadership, and also for organizations who really have that opportunity to help advance agendas, to really understand that governance is about giving the spaces, facilitate the opportunities for stakeholders to give their opinions, to raise their concerns, and always be genuine with the purpose. No hidden agenda. In FSC, I always have a formula that I've been involved in many participatory processes, and I always realize that you have a spectrum. 5% of the stakeholders are really against the other 5% in the other side of the spectrum. So they will never agree, because their ideas are completely incompatible. But then the closer you get to that common ground, you find that there are like 25% at the extremes who can be willing to find a compromise. And those you need to facilitate to really find that common ground, and they have to negotiate, go, and then there is that way to find the middle. And what happens with the extremes is not that they leave the table. Some would leave, but what they would do is that they would realize, okay, my viewpoint is completely contradictory to the other extreme. Therefore, I'm not going to win this battle. Or I join this 25%, or I find a compromise in this place. So this is my own experience of how I've seen FSC really balances these power dynamics at the end of the day.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Yeah, Lake, and I was going to ask you, Lake, I was just going to call on you as well. So, and ask you to maybe take a few minutes to reflect on how you see some of the challenges and possibly opportunities regarding collaborative governance in this very different sector with very different kinds of issues from the ones that you normally deal with. Yeah, so it's a very open set of questions or opportunity for you to reflect on the other panelists' comments.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to pick up a couple of threads from what Karina and Anna Karina have said, starting with Anna Karina, because I think probably the most important thing about participation when it's done well in the kind of context or framework that I provided at the beginning, rather than the technical checklist kind of thing, is that it builds relationships. And that's exactly what Anna Karina is saying, and I think it's also what Karina is saying. It builds relationships, it builds networks. If you want to use the social capital language, it builds both bonding, but most importantly, bridging social capital amongst very diverse actors. And what that can give you when it's done well is it can give you a long-standing resilience. So when things change, as they are changing today, and quite radically and quite unexpectedly, and often completely out of our control, as the pandemic has illustrated, you're building resilience into the system when you've already got those relationships, when you're not setting out in the middle of a crisis to try and build trust or try and get something going again. And I think that's a really, again, it's an essentially democratic benefit that you get from this. And certainly the Forestry Stewardship Council is a really, really interesting example of global networking, pro-environmental, very credible kind of governance around an issue which I was still a journalist when it was created, actually. And it was amazing. I was covering all these major conflicts over forestry projects in Tierra del Fuego and here, there, and everywhere. And out of that came the Forestry Stewardship Council with everything that Anna Karina has been telling us about and all these important benefits. So, but I want to come back to a couple of things that Karina said as well, because I see her still very focused on community relations as a function of her company functioning, working a little better, which is quite understandable. But at the same time, I have sort of two reflections. One is that I was still a journalist in the 1990s when we transitioned back from dictatorship toward an elected government. And I remember interviewing the CEO of Placer Dome at the time. It was Canadian at the time. And it was very, very interesting because most of the other foreign mining companies or not so much the foreign mining companies, but the press was saying that the foreign mining companies were freaked out about this democratic election and it was going to really make a mess of Chile and everything was going to fall apart. A little like what we're hearing now around the new constitution. And this guy was like, no, this is fantastic for us. It makes the rules much clearer. It makes it much easier for us to report to our shareholders. It does this and this, which is like very small, almost self-serving comments in a way. And yet at the same time, the impact in the political environment at the time was very significant. And it seems to me that that's a social responsibility role that is actually quite important. Because again, in Chile, we're talking about a constitutional reform, which is a pretty ordinary constitutional change by Canadian standards. I mean, this is not turning the world upside down or invoking the Soviet Revolution or anything else. This is just sort of, yeah, can we have a constitution that'll let us have decent pensions and decent health care and so on? So it seemed to me that in some of the things you said, Karina, that there was sort of gee, we could really use some good governance at the local level, that, you know, we sort of come in and all of a sudden we're having to replace the role of the local state, the municipal government. And this comes out a bit in one of the questions by Danilo Borja también. Have we gone so far around neoliberalism and let's get rid of everything that isn't the private sector and the market? Have we come so far around that big corporations in countries like Chile could also be contributing to public debate about sort of basic human decency and the institutions necessary to provide it?
Okay, thank you very much, Karina. Do you want a chance to come in and
Yeah,
respond
yeah,
just before you
sure.
have to leave? Yeah.
Yeah, one last comment. Thanks, Lake, and absolutely. I think that's part of the discussion that's going on right now, because as Canadians, and that's one of the debates that I love having here as well, is there's things that for us are just basic needs that should be covered, education, healthcare, pensions. And what we're seeing in Chile today is a move towards that. We just saw the Chilean president in Canada having some very important conversations with our prime minister precisely about these very items, these very public policies. This is about public policy, and it's about how we as a country here in Chile fund those policies, and how do we actually ensure that they're sustainable over time. And we as a mining industry, there are the opinions of the mining industry here, and that's expressed by the various associations. And I'm not speaking for them; I'm speaking for myself here. Let me make that clear. But there is a role to be played for the mining industry as well, as an industry that has a role to play in contributing to a better society. And we also have a role to play in the world of tomorrow with technology and sort of electromobility and in a cleaner planet and all of those things. So essentially, absolutely, we need to have these discussions, and we as an industry need to be part of those discussions, because we have a contribution to make. So that's the essence of it. And we cannot be providing as an industry what the state should be doing for the citizens of this country.
Okay, thank you very much.
I need to go now.
Yeah, you need to go. Okay, thank you very much for joining us, Karina.
Great meeting, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. There was another question that maybe I'll just throw open, a question from the audience, from Camilo Gil, who asks how you see the current trend in Latin America of left-leaning, populist, anti-establishment governments, in Colombia most recently, just a couple of days ago, Mexico, Chile, Honduras, Peru. How do that new trends fit with current approaches to collaborative governance in the region, especially because these movements are intertwined with environmental stewardship and often against external and corporate extractive industries. So maybe I'll pose that question to Ana Karina, how you see that kind of political shift in the region in the context of the forestry industry. Oh, your microphone. Yeah.
Yeah, I was muted. I could reflect on a more regional perspective, but I'm sure that Regina would have national perspective, because from the FSC in Chile, my understanding is that all these new trends are also giving the opportunity to recognize the stewardship of the forest and to work together, state, communities, hand in hand with the private sector to really find solutions. And a point I would really like to see these trends moving forward would be really this recognition of the true value of the forest. And my previous point, that is not only about timber and extraction. Actually, forests are ecosystems. And then the role of forest stewards, all the communities, all the people who actually make the forest exist, they don't get any benefit out of it. So my hope would be that these new trends incorporate these ideas more and more. I cannot say it's a new trend in a way. I come from Venezuela, so I have a bit of an internal debate around that, because this as being longer in the region, but I see like a new wave, because the previous wave was not necessarily really looking at environmental stewardship. This was not at least the case of Venezuela some years ago. But definitely, I see this new trend of really valuing, or really discussing the environment and including it in the way how societies are governed. I don't know if Regina would like to complement with the Chilean case that she has mentioned to me recently.
And just let me just jump in and invite the rest of the participants. So you both have your cameras on, and Lake, I would invite you to turn on your camera for this portion of the discussion of the Q&A. Regina.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry that I have been in and out in this meeting, but I take it from the last comment. I will take it from that comment. Okay, I think in this moment we are really facing a cultural change process. When FSC arrived in Chile, maybe Ana Karina already told you about that, we really can see a big change in the forestry sector. Everybody said that this before and after, when big companies implement FSC certification, particularly in the social performance, environmental and social performance, but particularly in the social performance. So I think we have been evolving from a controversial relationship to really an approach of collaboration. A lot of change, we can see a significant cultural change regarding companies, forestry companies, and the relationship with the social environment. And I think now the expectation from communities are higher, not only in a truly involvement in the decision-making process that regarding the situation that affect them, impacts, but also in a higher contribution to the local development. Karina said before that companies cannot really, I understood, really should not be involved in providing what the state should provide, but we can see that there is really high expectation that they work together to provide that higher contribution. And today, in the current situation of social crisis and this change, as the Lake clearly said about the Constitution, I can feel that people is more willing to express this with a higher voice, with their own voice. So maybe in the past they felt the same, but today I think communities are really expressing, saying this in a louder way. I just wanted to add that.
Okay, thank you. Let me pick up on something that Ana Karina mentioned in her presentation, and just kind of tease out this idea of, you made that distinction between the 5% on the one hand, on the 5% on the other side, and they're never going to get, so they're never going to come to an agreement, and then you focus on the moderates somewhere in the middle, and those 5% that will tend to come along. And I found that really interesting, because in another part of the sort of work that I've done and that I engage in that involves security issues, violent conflict, zones of conflict, some of which involves natural resources, both minerals, forests, and other natural resources. And so one of the really interesting debates there is, what do you do with the hardliners? So do you just engage the moderates, or do you also engage the hardliners? And it's a very common position. It's a really standard common view that just forget about the hardliners and just engage the moderates. And a lot of major international institutions, the United Nations and other international institutions, really follow that kind of policy. But other people are very critical of that perspective, and they argue that it's important to engage the hardliners, sometimes really bad people who do bad stuff, because they might be able to actually get things done and to deliver outcomes that might actually be implemented because they have control in many cases. So I wonder how, do you see that from your perspective, both maybe ask Lake how you see this in the urban context. Certainly in the urban context, there's a lot of bad people who do bad stuff, who, sometimes end up in jail for doing bad stuff. And so how do engaging those difficult actors play into your thinking about collaborative governance? And then I'll ask Ana Karina and Regina to reflect on the same question.
Well, I think there's something important to say at the start, though, and that is that not all hardliners are bad people doing bad things. Sometimes they're people who are really looking for root solutions, and they're holding out for them, and they're not willing to settle down for more of the same, for business as usual. And they definitely require a place at the table, because quite often we're limiting our vision when we're only sticking to the what is feasible today to solve problems that are destroying our future. We really can't stop at what is feasible today. We have to say we need this, and how are we going to make it possible? Which I think, from what I know of the history of the Forestry Stewardship Council, is a bit what they did. They said, no, we need this. How do we get to it? It's not a matter of saying, no, that's not possible today. Let's do something much simpler or much less effective now, because that's all we can do. So I think that's really important to take into account. And another, the way of framing this, I have a lot of trouble with left-right rhetoric, and this is a leftist government, and this is a rightist government. It's probably because I'm old, and actually leftist socialist government actually had real implications for who controls the economy and the war, and a whole series of things which just don't hold today. And the reason I bother to say that here and now is because I really think what we're facing in the world is a dichotomy between those who are willing to change and to even embrace change and say, yes, change is necessary. Yes, you're right. We don't really know what we're getting into, but we have to embrace it, and we have to figure out a way to get through it. And those who are saying, no, I just want what I've got. And that goes for really, really rich people who are defending everything they've achieved. But it also goes for a lot of very marginal, very precarious, very difficult situations and people who are in them because they think, oh, at least I know what I've got. It may not be great, but I've got it, and I'm managing to survive, and I'm terrified of change. And it seems to me that if you understand it in that sense and not the left-right dichotomy or range or whatever, you start to understand these languages, and so then in that frame to come back to hardliners, bad people who are doing bad things. Well, bad people who do bad things are not always bad, essentially, right? Bad circumstances lead to a lot of bad things. And we can see that kind of transition in thinking in drug addiction and trafficking, and particularly in Canada, much more so in Canada than elsewhere, but Portugal leading with, saying, no, drug addiction is the problem. The war on drugs has failed. It's a total flop. Drug addiction is the problem, and that belongs in public health. So how we frame these hardliners and these bad people doing bad things is really important. I live in a neighborhood that's been taken over by organized crime, that we have shootings pretty regularly, and knifings and all kinds of major problems. And so I'm very sensitive to bad people doing bad things. But at the same time, we muddle them all together, right? People who live on the street because they lost their homes during the quarantines. And we don't address them as people who lost their homes during the quarantines, or people who have no work, or people who have been marginalized by what has been a social catastrophe. So how do we address that? We have to reframe that as you know, the same way it's not the war against drugs, it's a public health problem. How do we resolve this? Where decriminalization and other things becomes a possibility. We need to do that kind of thing in these different dialogues. We need to find ways where people who are sure the world is flat and people who know the world is round can actually talk together. And we human beings actually have a lot of built-in capacities for that. But they all start from deliberative conversation and equalizing powers.
Excellent, thank you. Ana Karina or Regina, do you want to jump in?
I'm happy to continue. Yeah, absolutely. To what Lake has said, from the FSC perspective, these hardliners, there is a distinction because it's not that all stakeholders can join. No, and FSC has a policy for association that it's a mechanism that even enables or disassociates from stakeholders who are compromised with unacceptable activities, even if they are outside the forest that FSC manages. So if a company is converting forest in another country different where the place where they have their certificate, FSC can say, sorry, we are really about forest stewardship and good practices, and this is not the right way to manage forest or to treat human rights or to deal with legality. So this is a conflicted situation also within FSC because and this has been also part of the media exposure because of course once a company gets out of the system, this gets really known by the media. So yes, this differentiation, good players, bad players, is definitely key. And within the ones that, well, we don't want to be so binary, that's true, but those who are committed in things are not necessarily in line with the values of the governance system, no, that you could describe it that way. And I would like to go back because this phrase from Lake, this long-standing resilience is brilliant because it explains actually how you get this, it's not left, right, but it's like ideas that cannot be together. And this is the role also of the facilitators of that dialogue. At least to me, when I've seen these people, I spend so much time trying to understand why they have these ideas. And they say, no, you're not getting it, you are not getting it. And I keep trying. And in my own experience, the moment when I have, oh yeah, I got what this person means, I understand because this background, this situation, this perspective of the world makes this person think this way. And that internalization is really helpful. And even, at least in my own experience, I see these people in public fora, they fight, but then they come to me and they tell me, thank you for giving me the opportunity, for understanding. I know it's not easy. You have such a difficult job. Don't take it personally. So, and I realized that the result is way much better when you spend the time really understanding. And this is what ensures this long-term resilience, because the people who will defend, who will really, at least the FSC system, will be also those having these contradictory ideas, because they will say, sorry, I'm part of this system, I will defend FSC no matter what happens. And this goes to whatever in society, this is what happens in traditional politics. You just have political parties replacing every 5 years when there are, or 4 years when there are elections, and you don't have that long-standing resilience at all.
Excellent, thank you. Regina, do you want to jump in?
Well, I think my colleagues said almost everything. I totally agree with them. I don't know want to make it easy for me, but really, I really feel that. Maybe just to add that really today what we are seeing is maybe polarity, but polarity creates polarity. And I think we are very clear today that we are not going forward living in this poles. And I insist that we are facing this cultural this cultural change process. And we understand that it's a process, are not events, the cultural change. And for example, in relationship with communities, corporations all have this approach of to contribute to them or do something for them. Today, we are evolving to something together with them. So they are part of this. They participate. They have to participate in the decision making. Also, when we are trying to contribute and to make to contribute to a better livelihood. And the same in relationship with the government. There are many policies that do not work or do not contribute to this forest stewardship because we don't have good laws in every space or good policies to contribute, for example, for the development of smallholders in this sector and to make the sector more inclusive. And we realized that also that situation, it is also affected because those stakeholders do not participate in the decision making regarding the policies that will affect them. And so we need together to create a positive environment for these things to happen. And clearly living in the poles is not the way. And we need to find the ways to collaborate, as Lake said before, and we are not 100% prepared for that. But because of the crisis, I think we are learning fast, or we have to. There is no more time for this.
Excellent, thank you. There was a couple of other questions in the that people posed that in many ways bear on exactly this issue. So there's a question about so considering how different types of collaborative governance, network and multi-level governance, where civil entities, NGOs or civil society groups have a lot of representation with respect to input and their stakeholders. So they have a lot of representation vis-a-vis private and state entities. So how would you address, how do we address the issue of violence? So we talked about hardliners, but also, there's the question of violence in many cases, where the governance equation, especially pertaining to extractive industries, is often applied to disenfranchised, marginalized groups who sometimes have no other tools aside from violence to make their claims. So the questioner Camilo points out that this is especially notorious in the Amazon region. I would add that it's also an issue in other places, including in the south of Chile at this point. And there was a related question whether the labeling of hardliners is simply a tool to shift the Overton window mostly at the service of the corporate side of the discussion. In other words, to delegitimize claims that might have some validity. So claims that are made, in this uncivil way, sometimes, as the questioner posed, through violence. So how would we deal with that? How do you think about that internally, in the context of the forestry industry? Maybe Ana Karina, ask you to.
Yeah, same. Perhaps even Regina could complement because I come from a global perspective, and definitely all these things are part of the real consultation processes and the understanding of the big principles of FSC and what do they mean on the ground. Of course, there will be healthy conflict, but unhealthy conflict, and definitely violence is the unhealthy conflict. This is a structural problem. This is not something that a governance system like FSC can solve, because it's private governance. So if there are structural issues related to tenure, to use of the land, to corruption, to other dimensions, it's really hard for a system to enforce this, especially when there is violence around that. it just came to my mind an example of a forest area. I'm not gonna be specific on the country, but in Latin America, where the forest that is managed by FSC communities is next to a forest where there is violence and there is actually drug dealing activities, and it's a very tense environment because you have that boundaries, and you cannot simply go and be the police of that other portion of the forest where things are not really going well. And but at least when in terms of conservation outcomes, it is clear that the environment that FSC creates in the production area is way more inclusive and healthy. And there are some attempts by the communities to solve these issues by themselves, no, and not even this top-down approach like, yeah, we have the solution, we are the police, or the private sector either coming and saying, yeah, you should do things this way or that way. But this is really a global perspective. I'm sure that Regina can bring really more local and on the ground the dimension of violence in Chile.
Thank
Wow.
you.
Maybe
Difficult,
Lake knowing the situation we are facing here in Chile will help me. Maybe just to say that when it comes to violence, I think the dialogue stop. And when the dialogue stop, we cannot go forward. We need an intervention from outside. We are always promoting, as Ana Karina have been saying, that all of these approaches come from inside. We change the way we do business, we change the relationship with the environment. And so it's through change also. But when we have to deal with that violence and the dialogue stop, it is quite difficult to go forward.
Excellent, thank you.
Sorry.
Lake,
Yeah.
you want to? No, that's
Yeah.
great. You want just a final word?
Yeah, maybe just to add on violence, yeah, practically all judicial systems, ethical systems, political systems recognize the right to self-defense. And that's a case where it's still violence, it's still really complex, it still makes a massive dialogue, as Regina says so clearly. And then there's also, we create this state monopoly of violence, and all too often, especially in Latin America and especially less than democratic situations, we find that leads to the worst abuse and the worst violence, state violence against vulnerable people. So I guess just to close, because that could be a huge issue, and I know the time is running out, but just to say that it's really struck me the last year or so, and especially with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, how my generation, our icon was the peace symbol. And how that was just so normal. It was just like apple pie. It was this, peace was everything. I mean, by the time you were through, it was probably the most effective grassroots advertising campaign ever, was that peace is necessary. All we need is give peace a chance, and so on. And I think too often we focus on the violence and punishing it or doing this or doing that, and we don't focus enough on creating a culture of peace, that there is a value there that is peace, and that we really need to be, as we used to say in the times of the dictatorship, not the peace of the cemetery, but a democratic peace that is based, again, on human rights. And everybody's understanding that I may hate you, you may make me furious, you may make me want to jump up and down and scream, but you have every right to say what you're saying or to do what you're doing. And I would never endorse someone shooting you or running you down with a car.
Okay, thank you so much. This is that piece is a very hopeful, good note to end on. So, and also the necessity of dialogue is also a very good note to end on. So thank you so much to the panelists for a really stimulating and wonderful discussion. Hopefully the first of future discussions on this really important topic. Obviously, we've just barely scratched some surface, and but a really wonderful very stimulating discussion. Thank you so much. And thank you to the audience for joining us, and to the School of Public Policy for putting this on. Alim, do you want to say a final word?
A huge thank you to all of the panelists for today. And I can see here in the chat, there are still some questions that were ongoing. And if not for the time cutoff, I'm sure that we could be here for many hours more. And I think this is a testament to the level of engagement and what happens when you put a bunch of political scientists and social scientists and activists in a room. So as Pablo says, we'll look forward to exploring what we may be able to do in terms of subsequent sessions and discussions, which we'll invite you to again. And following the webinar early next week, we'll release the recording of it, and we'll make sure that that's shared to everyone so you have access, as well as the full biographies of all of our participants today. So on that note, I'll wish everyone a lovely afternoon. Thank you again. Special thank you to Pablo, and take care.